In the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, there is a place that should not exist. If you walk through the dense rainforest, hundreds of miles from civilization, you will find something strange. Red fire hydrants stamped with "Made in Detroit." Victorian houses with white porches, typical of the American suburbs, and the rusting carcass of a massive factory. But there is no one there, only the sound of the jungle devouring the metal. This is not a scene from a post-apocalyptic horror movie. This is Fordlândia, the most expensive ghost town in history. In 1928, the richest man in the world, Henry Ford, decided he could tame nature. He didn't just want rubber for his tires. He wanted to export the American dream to the middle of the tropical rainforest. He had infinite money, brilliant engineers, and an iron will. But he forgot one detail. In the jungle, money doesn't rule. The jungle rules. This is the story of how a visionary tried to build a utopia and ended up creating a green hell, and how he burned the equivalent of $200 million of today's money without producing enough rubber for a single tire. Welcome to Empire Ruin. The year is 1927. Henry Ford is not just a businessman, he's the most famous man on Earth. His factories in Detroit are a miracle of efficiency. Raw iron goes in one end and a Model T comes out the other, every 24 seconds. Ford obsessed over control. He owned the iron mines, he owned the coal mines, he owned the railways, he even owned the glass factories. He wanted to own everything. But there was one thing he did not own, and it was driving him mad: rubber. Every car needed tires, every engine needed hoses, and in the 1920s, rubber was liquid gold. But the United States did not control the supply. The British Empire did. Most of the world's rubber came from colonies in Southeast Asia, and the British knew they had America by the throat. A young Winston Churchill helped orchestrate a plan to restrict the supply of rubber, to artificially inflate the price, and force American companies to pay a fortune. Ford was furious. He famously said, "No man should be dependent on another man for his materials." He refused to pay the British tax. He looked at the map of the world, and his finger landed on the Amazon, the original home of the rubber tree. He didn't just want to buy rubber, he wanted to build his own supply chain from scratch. He negotiated a deal with the Brazilian government. In exchange for a promise of development, Ford received a massive tract of land on the banks of the Tapajós River. How big was it? 2.5 million acres, the size of the state of Connecticut or a small European country. He signed the check, and just like that, Henry Ford became the owner of a kingdom in the jungle. He thought he had solved the problem with his checkbook, but he had no idea that he had just bought his own graveyard. In 1928, the invasion began. Two massive ships, the Lake Ormoc and the Lake Farge, sailed up the Amazon River. They were not carrying soldiers, they were carrying Detroit. Henry Ford did not trust the jungle, and he did not trust Brazil. So he shipped an entire city, piece by piece, from the United States. The cargo manifest was insane. Prefabricated houses, heavy machinery, hospitals, schools, and most importantly for the Americans, ice machines and ice cream freezers. They arrived at the site and began to slash and burn the rainforest. It was a war against nature, but the jungle fought back immediately. The heat was suffocating, the rain was relentless, machinery rusted overnight, and the insects were a plague of biblical proportions. But money is a powerful fuel. Slowly, a surreal image began to rise from the mud. A perfect, white American town. It had concrete sidewalks. It had red fire hydrants on every corner. It even had an 18-hole golf course. It looked like a postcard from the Midwest dropped into the green hell. The American managers lived in spacious Victorian houses on Palm Avenue. They wore suits and ties in the blistering heat, refusing to adapt. They tried to impose the logic of the assembly line onto the chaos of biology. They believed they could clock in and clock out the forest. They planted the rubber trees in perfect, neat rows, just like cornfields in Michigan. It looked beautiful, orderly, efficient, but to any local botanist, those perfect rows didn't look like a plantation. They looked like an all-you-can-eat buffet for pests. The Americans were so busy building their utopia that they didn't notice the tension boiling in the worker camps. They had built the stage. Now, the tragedy was ready to begin. Henry Ford didn't just want to control the work. He wanted to control the soul. He imposed strict American Puritanism in the middle of the Amazon. Alcohol was banned, tobacco was restricted, even football was regulated. But the breaking point was the food. Ford forced the Brazilian workers to eat a healthy American diet: oatmeal, canned peaches, and brown rice, served in a sweltering cafeteria steaming with heat. The workers were hungry, tired, and sober. On December 20th, 1930, the pressure cooker exploded. In the main dining hall, a worker refused the food, and the riot began. It became known as the Revolt of the Pots. But it wasn't a protest, it was a demolition. Armed with machetes, the workers destroyed the cafeteria. They smashed the hated time clocks. They cut the telegraph wires. They overturned the trucks and threw them into the river. The American managers, the men in their white suits, ran for their lives. They fled to the boats anchored in the Tapajós River. They pushed away from the shore, watching in terror, hiding in the dark water while the city burned on the hill. For 3 days, the workers owned Fordlândia. The jungle had reclaimed the city, not with vines, but with rage. The Brazilian army had to be called in to restore order, but the damage was done. The dream of a perfect utopia was shattered, and yet the worst enemy had not even attacked yet. The riots were suppressed. The Brazilian army restored order, and for a brief moment, Henry Ford thought he had won. The trees were growing. The factory was ready. The dream was alive. But Henry Ford made a mistake that any local Indian could have told him. In the wild, rubber trees grow far apart, isolated from each other. This is nature's defense mechanism against disease. But Ford applied the logic of mass production. He planted millions of trees, shoulder to shoulder, crammed together, waiting to be harvested. He created the perfect buffet. In 1933, the enemy arrived. It wasn't a competitor or a government. It was a fungus, Microcyclus ulei.
also known as leaf blight. It started slowly. The leaves turned black, then they withered, then they fell. And because the trees were so close together, the fungus jumped from one host to the next like wildfire. It moved through the plantation with terrifying speed, killing everything in its path. Ford's engineers tried everything. They sprayed chemicals, they pruned branches, but it was useless. The jungle was digesting the plantation. And then came the bugs, lace bugs, caterpillars, spider mites. Clouds of insects descended on the weakened trees, stripping them bare. Henry Ford, the man who mastered steel and iron, was powerless against biology. He could fire a worker, he could bribe a politician, but he could not negotiate with a fungus. The rubber never flowed, the latex never came, the factory stayed silent.
By 1945, the dream was dead. The world had changed. Synthetic rubber had been invented during World War II. The Amazonian rubber was no longer needed. Henry Ford was now an old man, dying. He had poured $20 million into the jungle, hundreds of millions in today's money, and in return, he received nothing but silence. The most tragic detail of this story? Henry Ford, the man who built this entire city, never set foot in Fordlândia, not once. He watched his Utopia collapse from a dark office in Detroit. When his grandson, Henry Ford II, took over the company, he looked at the books. He saw the bleeding wound in Brazil, and he decided to cut it off. He sold the entire city back to the Brazilian government. The land, the houses, the hospital, the power plant, everything. Do you know the price? $244,000. He sold a $20 million empire for pennies. The Americans packed their bags. They turned off the lights on Main Street, and they left. The jungle didn't wait. Vines climbed the water tower. Rust ate the machinery, and the silence returned.
Today, Fordlândia is a cemetery of arrogance. People still live there, squatters, descendants of the workers. They live inside the rotting shells of the American dream. If you visit, you can still see the fire hydrants, useless, hidden in the tall grass. You can see the hospital where the best doctors in the world once worked. Now it is a ghost. There is a final, brutal irony in this story. Henry Ford famously hated cows. He thought they were inefficient. Today, the land he bought to revolutionize industry is used for cattle ranching. The cows won. Fordlândia teaches us a lesson that billionaires keep forgetting. You can buy politicians, you can buy land, you can even buy people, but you cannot buy nature. Henry Ford tried to conquer the Amazon, and the Amazon just swallowed him whole. I am Empire Ruin, and I'll see you at the next collapse.